Greetings. Welcome to Prescription for Justice. My name is Martin Donahue. Today's topic is corporate personhood. And when you're battling corporations, you have to be tough. Hence I wore my Tyrannosaurus Rex tie. Conservative economist Milton Friedman once said, quote, "The only social responsibility of business is to increase its profits," end quote. Noam Chomsky was more blunt. He stated, "Corporations have no moral conscience. They are designed by law to be concerned only for their stockholders and not their stakeholders, like the community or the workforce." Today, there are almost 6 million corporations worldwide. 148 corporations control 40% of the world's wealth, and 500 companies control 70% of world trade. 69 of the world's 100 largest economies are private corporations. Only 31 are countries. This leads to some interesting comparisons. For instance, Walmart has more annual revenue than Spain and Australia, Royal Dutch Shell more than Mexico, and United Health Group more than Denmark and Saudi Arabia. The top 1% of Americans own 35% of all stocks, bonds, and mutual assets, while 48% of Americans own no stock. The consequences of differential stock ownership are that corporations are primarily answerable to their owners and shareholders, a small and wealthier subsegment of the population, and less answerable to their employees. While corporations shouldered over 30% of the nation's tax burden in 1950, they are responsible for only 8% today. Nearly 1/3 of all large U.S. corporations pay no annual tax. The reasons for inadequate corporate taxation include corporate-friendly tax laws, tax breaks and loopholes, and offshore tax havens and shell companies used to shelter capital, the latter leading to lost annual tax revenues of $100 billion for the United States and $250 billion worldwide. Cheating and underpayment of corporate taxes is common, and auditing programs are understaffed and underfunded. Each year in America, we lose $3.8 billion to burglary and robbery, but much more to corporate crime. This includes $100 to $400 billion to healthcare fraud, $40 billion to auto repair fraud, $15 billion to security fraud, and the list goes on. The savings and loan meltdown of the 2008 Depression cost between $300 billion and $500 billion. Fines associated with corporate malfeasance are meager and often considered a cost of doing business. Corporate crime is under-prosecuted and prosecutors underfunded. Federal prosecutions of white-collar crime, including corporate crime, are down 25% over the last 2 decades. Corporate interests are promoted through U.S. laws and regulations and by trade agreements such as NAFTA, CAFTA, the TPP, and international bodies like the IMF and World Bank. And World Trade Organization's structural adjustment programs also exacerbate poverty and hunger and facilitate environmental destruction in the developing world while shifting wealth towards corporations and governments in the developed world. Corporations internalize profits while externalizing social and environmental costs. This can be seen, for instance, when a company mines a given area, creates an ecological catastrophe, and subsequently sells the mine to a subsidiary, which then declares bankruptcy, leaving U.S. taxpayers to foot the bill for environmental remediation and healthcare costs for the community. Corporations and their wealthy owners spend vastly more than citizens' organizations to influence elections and governmental decisions, and it pays off. In 2015, federal lobbying groups spent a total of $3.2 billion, while all single-issue ideological groups combined, pro-choice, anti-abortion, feminist and consumer organizations, senior citizens, and so on, spent under $100 million. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the largest business lobby, spent $85 million on lobbying in 2015, while the AFL-CIO and the SEIU, the 2 largest labor unions, spent just $6 million combined. Other estimates show corporations spending $86 for every $1 spent by civic groups. Return on campaign contributions for elections for the most politically active companies is estimated to be about $760 per $1 spent. Estimates of returns on lobbying range from $28 to $212 for every $1 spent, but higher values are more likely. A 2008 to 2014 Oxfam study of 50 major U.S. corporations found returns of $130 in tax breaks and $4,000 in tax subsidies for every $1 spent on lobbying. Over the 2015 to 2016 election cycle, oil, gas, and coal companies spent $354 million in campaign contributions and lobbying and received $29 billion in federal subsidies, an astounding 8,200% return on their investment. It should not surprise anyone that after leaving office, 50% of senators and 42% of representatives go on to become lobbyists. My guest today is David Delk, chair of the Oregon Progressive Party, national co-chair of the Alliance for Democracy, and founder of the Portland chapter of Move to Amend, dedicated to a 28th constitutional amendment to ending corporate personhood and money as speech. I should also mention that David is a good friend and mentor, having had me on his own show quite a few times. So I'm delighted to have him here. Welcome,
Great.
David.
Thank you, and I'm delighted to be here.
Before we start talking about the concept of corporate personhood, bring us back to the beginning of the United States as a country and what happened with the king, parliament, and how the colonies, not just in America but elsewhere, were set up.
Okay. Well, the origins were that all of the colonies were established by the British government for the purpose of raising money for the king, and in some cases they were established in order to get religious fanatics out of Britain. Mm-hmm. So there was that additional thing. Uh-huh. But the objective in all cases was that these colonies would make profits and return those profits back to the king. Mm-hmm. And when I say back to the king, that's on purpose, because the monarch was pretty supreme, and while they had Parliament at the very beginning, it was always what the king wanted, and so they formed these colonies, and these colonies were established by royal corporations, and those royal corporations then in turn, and the royal corporations generally got members of Congress, members of the Parliament, mm-hmm. to invest in them. So everybody was really happy with this arrangement, and so the royal corporation appointed the governor and the sub-governors and the various mayors and so forth and other officials in these mm-hmm. colonies, with the responsibility of, again, returning a profit back to the crown.
Right. So in some sense, the American Revolution was a reaction to corporate control of the colonies.
Yes, right. So we always hear about no taxation without representation, and that was one of the rallying cries for the founding of the United States. But the other part of that was that the American rebels understood that it was the corporations which had the power, and in order to get something that would benefit the people who actually lived in the colonies, we needed to get rid of those corporations.
Okay. Tell me about corporate personhood. What does it mean, and how did that come to be a thing?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So when we established our nation under the Constitution, there were very few corporations in the United States because they had all been kicked out. Mm-hmm. And so most of the business and so forth was done with agreements between individuals. Most of it was local, and over a period of time, they found that there was a need to have some corporations for building roads or building dikes or whatever it was they particularly needed. So these corporations were all locally controlled, mm-hmm. and they were chartered by the states. So each state had their own process, their own rules, and so forth. And in fact, the U.S. Constitution makes no mentions of corporations whatsoever, because the founding fathers thought, well, corporations, if we need them, will always be created for a specific local project and need. And so that was the original thinking about it. And those corporations that were created were subject to regulation of the state. They were subject to specific objectives, and they were limited in terms of time. And if the corporation didn't do what it was supposed to do, it could be dissolved by the state. And if it had been engaged in behavior which was harmful to the general population, particularly the wealthy landowners, then those people that owned that corporation could be fined. And the liability, now we think of corporations as having limited liabilities. The original concept was that if you didn't do what you were supposed to do, then the owners, the shareholders of the corporation could be fined 2, 3, even 5 times their original investment. So they really had a reason to do what they're supposed to do.
Right, certainly nothing like today.
Nothing
and yet
like
at some
today.
point that changed, and they became national and today even international entities.
Right. And so the first case, sort of the first case that established the idea of corporate personhood was a case of the Santa Clara County in California versus the Southern Pacific Railroad. And that was a case that had to do with taxing fence posts. And so that was what the Supreme Court was supposed to be thinking about and doing, and they made their judgment on that question. But there was a court reporter at the time who was responsible for writing the summary of the decision, and he wrote the summary for this particular case as saying that corporations are people and have 14th Amendment rights to due process and to equal protection of the laws. So from that decision, this whole idea of corporate personhood was built over time on that false premise that the court reporter stated as the summary.
Well, we talk about someone who's anonymous to the history books today, having such immense power and control over subsequent decades and centuries.
Yes, right.
And it sounds like that finding has been recapitulated or reinforced by subsequent Supreme Court decisions.
Yes, there have been a whole slew of decisions which have happened over a period of time, so that corporations now have, let me read my list.
Sure.
So for First Amendment free speech rights, including the right not to speak, which is a very important thing, and we can come back to that. Fourth Amendment protection against search and seizure. Fifth Amendment due process rights. Fifth Amendment takings protection from regulatory law. Fifth Amendment ban on double jeopardy. Sixth Amendment rights to jury trials in criminal cases, and then Seventh Amendment rights to jury trial in a civil case. And now with the recent Hobby Lobby decision, they can also, if they're closely held privately owned corporations, they can claim a First Amendment right to freedom of religion. So they went from originally having great responsibilities and great obligations to the other side of the scales in having rights that they could claim.
Right.
Rights that were in the Constitution or as part of the Bill of Rights, which were most clearly added to protect people.
Right. Yeah, again, just to emphasize what you said, the word corporations is not in the Constitution, and certainly all these rights that they're claiming under the different amendments, and the Hobby Lobby case in particular, allows a company to obtain a religious exemption to deny women access that they should be getting under the Obama plan or PPACA to basic reproductive health care.
Absolutely, and that's what the Hobby Lobby decision was about.
Thus imposing their religious beliefs on thousands of workers and denying them health care with consequent effects on their health, their ability to make child care planning decisions and so on.
Right, yeah. So let's go back to that First Amendment free speech right, which includes the right not to speak. What that means is that state governments or local governments, whoever, cannot require a company to say, cannot require a label, for instance, on a product that says where it was made or how it was made. One of the decisions that established this right, I believe, was in Vermont, where they wanted to have beef labeled whether it had growth hormones in it or not.
Right.
And so this was a very important issue to them. It was a very important issue in general. But the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, you cannot do that, because to do that requires them to speak. You cannot require them to speak.
Right, and they'll constantly hide behind this concept of trade secrets to avoid telling the public what's in their products. And you're right, that's a big problem in agriculture. It's a big problem when it comes to the genetic modification of crops. It's a big problem when it comes to consumer products like makeup and hair dyes, and not being required to say what potential toxins might be in those products, of which, with respect to cosmetic products, the Environmental Working Group has found are myriad and various.
Yeah.
If anyone is interested, on my website, there are open access PowerPoint slideshows dealing with the issue of corporations and this First Amendment right to not tell the public, related to corporate agriculture, beauty and body modification, the pharmaceutical industry, the health insurance industry. And I invite people to take a look at those, and feel free to use them with appropriate citation for their own talks. Now, there have been a series of court decisions subsequent to that one where the court reporter took it upon himself to give corporations this identity of personhood. Walk us through what's happened over the last century and a half to bring us to today.
Well, let me actually first start with going back in our history and making note that for you and I and the majority of the people in the United States, we have had centuries of struggles to actually get the rights that are listed in the Bill of Rights, and having it apply to all of the people. When we founded the nation, only about 5% of people were actually covered by the Bill of Rights, because slaves were property. Indians weren't recognized as being people at all. Women were not recognized as having the rights, and quite frequently, in order to vote, you had to have a certain amount of property. So there was a lot of people, just, they may have qualified otherwise, but they didn't have enough property. So a lot of people say that the Constitution is really a property rights document, not a human rights document.
In fact, at the time it was written, only 5% of those who today can be called citizens were actually eligible to vote.
Exactly, right, yeah. And then, so our history is really this history of struggle on the parts of various groups and people to get those rights. And so we're reasonably, not perfectly, but reasonably complete in giving those rights, or seeing that the majority of the population has those rights. And of course we know that particularly Republicans are engaged in active campaigns to withdraw voting rights from particular people. And so it's not perfect, but the point is we have really struggled with wars and labor strikes and so forth to get those rights and to make everybody equal before the law.
And I would just emphasize that a majority of our Congress are millionaires, as are all 9 Supreme Court justices.
Yes, right. Yeah, yes, they're
a small fraction of the upper echelons economically of society.
Absolutely not representative of us at all. But still, we keep putting them there. But that's a whole different question, right? Yeah. So that part of the struggle was what we did, but corporations didn't do that. Corporations never struggle to get their rights. What they do is they go to the court system and have the rights given to them. And so my really quick summary of what has happened is they have continuously gone to the courts to assert their rights. And the courts, particularly the Supreme Court, has been very willing to grant those rights to them.
And that really reached its zenith in the Citizens United decision.
Yes, in the Citizens United decision, 2011, of another one of the 5-4 decisions on the part of the Supreme Court, said that we cannot ban corporations from participating in elections of candidates. And so what that has done is it has given rise to these super PACs that are not accountable to anybody. They generally don't have to reveal who is giving them the money to engage in these very expensive races. So if
that's the dark money.
That's the dark money, and one of the requirements for having a democracy is having transparency. We all need to know what is going on, and Citizens United has given rise to these super PACs and the dark money where we don't know. And not only do we not know who's giving it, we also don't know where those people might live. Do they live in the United States, or do they live in another country? We don't know.
Right.
Now, at the time of the decision, Congress was controlled by Democrats. The Senate was controlled by Democrats, and we had Obama was the president, so we had a Democrat. It would have been easiest at that point in time to have actually enacted regulations that required disclosure, that set limits on the size of donations, because the Supreme Court did not say you can't have regulations, didn't say you can't limit money, it just said you can't ban corporate money in the process.
So clearly the Democratic Party is as beholden to corporate interests as the Republican Party is.
Yes.
In our limited time remaining, and we have just a couple of minutes, tell me what Move to Amend is and what you hope to do at the local and national level.
Okay, yeah. So Move to Amend is a national organization which formed immediately after the decision, anticipating that they knew what the outcome would be. And it was as they expected. It was giving more rights to corporations and freeing them from regulation. So they formed with the purpose of amending the U.S. Constitution to say that corporations are not people and that money is not speech. Those are the two things that, and they have proposed a specific constitutional amendment which is in Congress, is H.J.R. 48, and I would recommend for anybody who is interested in this for people to call their U.S. representatives and tell them that you support this amendment and you want them to add themselves on as co-sponsors. So here in Oregon, Representative Blumenauer, Representative Bonamici, and Representative DeFazio have all signed on as co-sponsors, but we don't really expect that Greg Walden will ever sign on, being a high-level Republican. But we should expect that Representative Kurt Schrader, a Democrat, should also join the ranks. So we really encourage people to call Kurt Schrader and say, join on as a co-sponsor of this bill.
And at the state level, I understand
yeah.
Oregon is fairly unique in terms of its willingness to allow unlimited corporate contributions to campaigns.
Yeah, right. So at the national level, we got all this discussion about what regulations should be. At the local level in Oregon, our Oregon Supreme Court has declared that any limitations on campaign contributions, expenditures, and so forth is unconstitutional. And that's in spite of the fact that our Constitution is almost identical in wording to the constitutions of 26 other states, all of whom limit campaign contributions. So we have a couple of things which we're doing. One, for the 2020 ballot, we will be gathering signatures for a Oregon constitutional amendment that says that that we can limit campaign contributions and expenditures, and so watch for that. Sign it. Contact the Oregon Progressive Party if you want more information, and then locally here in the city of Portland, we're currently gathering signatures for an initiative for the 2020 ballot, which would limit campaign contributions for candidates running for city offices.
Right. So be sure to look into the Alliance for Democracy, Move to Amend. I think this is an important issue that you mentioned about other countries being able to donate, certainly in this time when we're looking at the federal level, at Russia and other nations interfering with our elections. I think it's important at the state level because many state initiatives see money pouring in from out of state that have influenced the results of elections here. I know with respect to Measure 97 about corporate taxation and the GMO labeling bill. I invite people once again to go to the Public Health and Social Justice website for the open access PowerPoints. Watch our shows on YouTube, Prescription for Justice. David, it's been a great pleasure. Fantastic to have you on.
Great.
I look forward to talking again in the future.
Great.
And thanks to all our viewers for joining us.